My marriage was a mistake, a huge mistake. Not because of Brianna, my wife. She was fine in many ways, but her mother was another story entirely. A dragon who despised me and never missed a chance to show it. I'm no saint, sure, but I'm no villain either. People have good and bad sides, and I'm no different. I've been mixed up in some questionable situations, though I've never done time. One close call was avoided thanks to my school friend Brett, who, while studying law, helped me out. Brett and I go way back. He's small, wears thick glasses, and was more into books than girls. When some boys at school started picking on him, I stood up for him, promising to knock anyone flat who bothered him. And I did. Now, I'm 32, working as a self-employed rock driller, digging 100-meter deep holes for thermal heating systems. It's good work and pays well. I've been married to Brianna for nearly 6 years, and we have a son who came along 5 months after the wedding. We live in a nice house in a quiet Scandinavian town, the kind of place where you might expect a picture-perfect family. But we aren't, thanks to her mother. The dragon has hated me from the start, ever since I stole her daughter, who already had a boyfriend her mother liked. I've lost plenty of battles with her, but I'm determined to win the final round. It all started on Midsummer Eve 6 years ago. Midsummer is a major holiday in Scandinavia, celebrated since Viking times. I was engaged to Lauren then, a lovely girl. We were set to move in together that August, as I had arranged for a bigger apartment. But a dispute over her cousin's wedding on Midsummer Eve changed everything. Lauren was invited alone, a serious breach of etiquette for an engaged couple. I knew it was an insult because of my bad boy reputation. Lauren admitted I was right, but still wouldn't skip the wedding. We argued, and in the end, I told her that if her cousin was more important, she could stay there forever. An hour later, I regretted it and tried calling her several times that day, but her phone was off. That evening, we'd been invited to a party at a friend's cottage, so I went alone. At the party, I met Brianna. She was there with her fiancé, who couldn't hold his liquor. I helped her put him in the back seat of his car, and afterward, we went back to the party and danced. Later, we took a walk under the twilight sky to a nearby lake and ended up on a small pier, getting cozy. I could tell she was drawn to my bad boy image. Pretty women tend to be, though I don't understand why. She melted under my touch, and soon we ended up in the guest room she and her fiancé had booked. I took my time with her, and to my surprise, I discovered she was a virgin. A real trophy, I thought back then. I promised to be careful, but after we slept together, she wore a happy smile, and neither of us felt regret. When we woke up the next morning, her fiancé found us together and threw his engagement ring at her in a fit of rage. When Lauren returned from the wedding, she called me, admitting I was right about the invitation. She'd tried calling me several times too, hoping to make things right, but when she found out I'd slept with Brianna, she was furious and declared that our engagement was over for good. I called her a few weeks later, thinking she'd calm down, but she told me to take a hike. Around that same time, Brianna rang my doorbell. She looked worried and told me, "I'm pregnant and you're the father," then started crying. We talked for hours. She insisted I was the only man she'd ever been with and planned to keep the baby. She asked if I'd step up, and though I didn't feel ready, I agreed. She was kind and good-natured, maybe not as exciting as Lauren, but a solid choice for a wife. So, we decided to marry. Love was important to me, and I believed our feelings could grow. After all, there'd been a spark on that midsummer night. She stayed the night, and we made love again, this time with more tenderness. I resolved to make the best of it. The next day, we visited her parents to share the news. Her mother's reaction was a disaster. She called me a hooligan for corrupting her innocent daughter and threatened to ruin me. Her father just stood by, silent. It wasn't a promising start with the in-laws. Brianna's family ran a once successful printing business, now struggling against competition from newer companies. I was unemployed at the time, and her mother saw an opportunity to control me by offering me a job at the print shop at a terrible wage. I refused and preferred living on my unemployment benefits, which paid more. Meanwhile, I picked up side work with a rock driller. Her mother retaliated by filing a complaint to get my benefits cut off, which failed. Then, she had a lawyer draft a prenup that left me with nothing if the marriage failed. I asked Brett to amend it fairly, which Brianna signed without telling her mother. 2 months later, we married at the town hall in a quiet ceremony. Brett and her best friend were the witnesses. 5 months later, our son was born. Our relationship gradually grew into something that resembled real love. and for the next 2.5 years, we were truly happy. Not long after, I had the chance to buy the rock drilling business, and with help from Brett and the seller, I secured a bank loan. But when our son was old enough to start daycare, things began to change. Brianna returned to work at the print shop, and her mother's influence over her started to grow. That's when the real trouble began. With Brianna back at the print shop and our son in daycare, my problems with her mother, the dragon, only intensified. Brianna was expected to eventually take over the family business, and her mother wasn't shy about making her opinions known. While Brianna was working under her mother's critical eye, our marriage, once full of warmth, started showing signs of strain. Around this time, the dragon began losing money on stocks. She'd made a small fortune in the past, but when the market shifted, her investments started tanking. Meanwhile, I'd made a killing on stocks thanks to a tip from Brett, who was now a lawyer. I couldn't resist bragging to Brianna, which I knew would reach her mother. As a surprise, I bought Brianna a Toyota Yaris as a shopping car. She loved it and told her mother about it, who immediately grew suspicious, wondering where I was getting my financial advice. Sensing an opportunity for payback, I devised a trick with Brett's help. I asked him to find some worthless junk stocks and made a fake analysis in Excel, showing an expected profit for a company called Novacrest. Brianna had probably snooped on my laptop and passed it on to her mother. Not long after, the dragon invested heavily in Novacrest, and the stocks tanked. When Brianna asked if I'd lost any money on it, I just shrugged and said I'd cashed out at the top. This small win felt satisfying, but I knew it wouldn't be the last battle. Rumors began to circulate that her mother had made a bet with her friends that she'd see me out of the picture by the time our son started school. According to her, Brianna would not only divorce me, but walk away with most of what I had, likely to invest in the family business. To make matters worse, she even started inviting young, single men from her social circle to family gatherings, hoping one of them might capture Brianna's attention. Some of them were the well-dressed, smooth-talking type who knew exactly how to charm women. It was only a matter of time before one of them made a real impression on her. When I finally confronted Brianna about her mother's intentions, she was outraged. "What the hell do you think of me?" she snapped, adding, "Of course, I'd be furious if any of those men tried something." Her response gave me a brief glimmer of hope, but I couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth. Brianna and I were drifting apart, and it was happening right in front of me. As Brianna started working full-time, the cracks in our relationship widened. I wanted another child, but she refused. Our once thriving intimacy dwindled to a bare minimum. She became absorbed in trying to save the print shop, which her mother, with her old-fashioned ideas, had driven into decline. My business, meanwhile, was booming. With oil prices rising, the demand for thermal heating systems surged, bringing in great profits. Though I was busy, I made an effort to help at home, trying to keep our family life on track. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was functional. I pleaded with Brianna to leave the print shop and come work with me instead, but she refused, choosing loyalty to her mother's failing business over her family's future. Her weekend trips to her parents' summer house became more frequent, taking our son with her. At first, I didn't say much, but eventually it became too much to bear. I told her we needed more time together as a family and suggested we invite some friends over for a barbecue. She agreed, but soon fell back into her old habits, spending more and more weekends away. 3 months after our argument, she returned to her routine, and our social life dwindled. Anytime I suggested spending time together, she brushed it off or came up with excuses. The dragon's influence was winning, and our family was crumbling. Then, one day my son mentioned Sean kissing Mom. He was young, but he'd seen something that made me uneasy. I wasn't shocked. After all, Brianna had once cheated on her ex-boyfriend with me. Was it so hard to believe she'd do the same now? This news came as no surprise, but it confirmed what I had dreaded. My marriage was on the brink of collapse. Despite the disappointment, a part of me felt oddly relieved. The endless battles with her mother, the constant tension, it all seemed close to ending. Yet, I owed it to my son and to the marriage I had tried so hard to make work. I decided to give Brianna one last chance to prove that she still cared about us. One Friday evening, Brianna told me she had to go to her mother's the next morning. As always, she planned to return on Sunday evening. I took a deep breath and told her, "Why don't you stay home this weekend? We could spend time as a family, maybe have a barbecue." She looked taken aback. "I've already promised Mother I'd be there," she said, almost guiltily. "She has some friends visiting, and I need to help her." Her mention of friends irked me, especially when I thought of Sean. You mean friends like Sean? I asked. For a moment she seemed startled, but she quickly composed herself. He's an old family friend who helps with the EU regulations Mother's been struggling with. And how old is he? About 30, I think. A good-looking single guy? I pressed. She hesitated. He's married, but his wife's away working with the UN in Kosovo. That's why he's free to help. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. What's your relationship with him, really? This time she seemed irritated. Strictly business, don't insult me. I could feel my frustration building. You cheated on your ex when we met. How do I know you won't do it again? She glared at me. Don't be ridiculous. That was different. I fell in love with you, and I still love you. But her words rang hollow. I could feel the truth slipping through my fingers, and the woman I once knew seemed like a stranger. I decided then and there, this marriage was nearing its end, and I'd make sure it ended on my terms. I contacted Dave, an old friend who'd once joked about his skills with a camera, and enlisted him to help me set up a small wireless camera in our bedroom. If Brianna brought Sean home, I wanted irrefutable proof. We connected the camera to a motion sensor, which would start recording if anyone entered the room, even in low light. The setup was flawless, hidden in a spot she'd never think to look. A part of me felt dirty, as if I'd become someone I didn't recognize. But the idea of being blindsided by another betrayal, of being humiliated again, pushed me forward. And knowing how manipulative her mother was, I needed something they couldn't twist or cover up. That Friday, as Brianna packed for her family weekend, I made my offer one last time. You don't have to go. Stay home with us, with your family. We can try to fix what's wrong between us. She gave me an exasperated look. You'll get your quality time next Friday, she said half-heartedly. It's Midsummer Eve. We'll spend the whole day together, just like we used to. Midsummer Eve? I scoffed. What, I get one night out of the year? Maybe that's only because Sean's wife is back, and he won't have time for you? Her eyes filled with anger. That's enough. You're paranoid, and it's pathetic. She didn't seem to notice the hurt and anger that showed on my face. With a shake of her head, she grabbed her bag and walked out, not bothering to look back. It was like watching a stranger, someone I no longer knew, as she closed the door behind her. The weekend dragged on, each hour heavy with anticipation. On Saturday evening, I felt the need to clear my head and went out to my favorite pub. After a drink or two, I noticed a familiar face in a nearby booth. Mona, a friend of my ex-girlfriend Lauren. I went over to say hello and asked if she'd heard from Lauren recently. Oh, didn't you know? Mona replied. Lauren's back in town. She's been divorced for a while now, bought a little house here a couple of weeks ago. Hearing that hit me like a revelation. Really? I had no idea, I said, trying to play it cool. Well, give her my best. Mona smiled and handed me Lauren's number. Why don't you tell her yourself? After some hesitation, I decided to call her. When Lauren answered, I could hear the surprise in her voice. But the conversation flowed easily, and by the end, I had set up a lunch date for Saturday. Returning home that night, I didn't say a word to Brianna. The next morning, she was gone, heading to her mother's as usual, and I went back to work. By noon, I was at the restaurant waiting for Lauren. The familiar flutter of excitement returned, as if it were the first time we'd met. When she walked in, looking as radiant as ever, I felt a pang of regret for what we could have been. We caught up over lunch, laughing and reminiscing about old times. It felt so natural, so easy, compared to the strained tension of my marriage. After lunch, we took a walk in the nearby park, and she looked at me with a question in her eyes. What was the real reason you wanted to see me again? There was no easy answer, so I went with honesty. Faith, hope, and charity, I guess. For a moment, she looked uncertain, but then she took my hand. There's something I've wanted to tell you for years, she admitted. I made a mistake, Logan. Going to that wedding without you, refusing to talk things over. I was so humiliated and hurt that I couldn't see past it. I regretted it every day. Hearing those words opened a door I thought had closed. I made my mistakes too, I replied. Seducing Brianna that midsummer eve, letting things get this far. But sometimes, you don't realize what matters until it's too late. She squeezed my hand, and in that moment, I knew I wanted a fresh start, a new beginning free from betrayal and bitterness. But first, I had to close the door on my marriage, once and for all. By the time midsummer arrived, I'd prepared everything. I told Brianna I was taking our son on a week-long holiday to a friend's summer house, a plan we'd had for months. She pretended to be disappointed but agreed, saying she had to work anyway. I watched her closely as I loaded the car and promised to call every day. She stood on the driveway, waving us off with a faint smile. Instead of leaving town, I drove to Lauren's house, where I'd hidden my car. I'd let Brett and his wife know about my plan, and they'd agreed to cover for me if Brianna called. Around 6 that evening, Lauren drove by our house, circling back an hour later. When she returned, she told me she'd seen a silver Volvo parked in the driveway, Sean's car. At 11 p.m., I took Lauren's bicycle and snuck back to our house. The monitor connected to the hidden camera was still in the garage, and as I switched it on, I saw exactly what I'd feared. There, in the dim light of our bedroom, was Brianna, laughing with Sean. She looked more alive than she had in years, her face filled with excitement. Seeing her like this with him turned my anger into a cold resolve. I had the evidence I needed to finally close this chapter. I stayed watching on the monitor, waiting until they fell asleep. Around 1 a.m., I texted my friend Dave, who showed up in minutes, bringing along his video camera. I wanted a witness, someone who could testify to what I found. It was also Dave's idea to record everything himself, just in case Brianna's mother tried to spin the story her way. After a quick briefing, we headed into the house. The master bedroom door was shut. I cracked it open and peered inside to see Brianna and Sean sound asleep, wrapped in each other's arms. I stepped aside, and Dave began recording, switching on a bright light that flooded the room. I let him film for a few seconds before I threw the covers off them. "What the hell is this?" I shouted. They jolted awake, both shielding their eyes from the light. As they blinked in confusion, I watched realization dawn on Brianna's face. She let out a cry. "No, no, no!" Dave nodded at me, and I handed him the camera. He took a grip on Sean's arm, pulling him out of the bed and down the hall, leaving me alone with Brianna. I heard a scuffle and some shouting as Dave wrestled him into the hallway, then the sound of a door slamming and a car starting. Dave had thrown Sean's clothes onto the driveway. He'd driven off, humiliated, wearing nothing but his boxers. In the bedroom, Brianna sat on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She didn't try to explain or lie. Maybe she knew there was no point. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something. Anything. "You've ended our marriage," I said coldly. "Pack your things. Dave will call a taxi to take you back to your mother's. Tomorrow, I'm changing the locks, and I'll have your belongings boxed up by the afternoon." She looked up, shock and fury flickering across her face. "You can't do this," she sputtered. "You have no right to throw me out." "You gave me every right the moment you invited him into our bed," I replied. "And I'll see you tomorrow at 4 p.m. We can discuss dividing our things then. But don't bring your parents. They're not welcome here anymore." The taxi arrived, and she left without another word, her face pale. After she was gone, I went into the garage, grabbed a sledgehammer, and smashed our bed to pieces. The rage and hurt from years of lies and manipulation fueled every swing. By morning, the frame was a pile of splinters on the driveway. I called Lauren to tell her everything was over with Brianna. "I've got my freedom now," I said, my voice sounding strange even to me. I couldn't sleep, so I went to the garage to retrieve the video. Rewatching the footage was a painful reminder of what I'd endured, but it also solidified my determination. Brianna's affair wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was calculated, a betrayal that had gone on for who knows how long. Later that day, I called Sean's wife, who was stationed with the UN in Kosovo. I told her the truth, sparing no details, even offering to send clips of the video if she needed evidence. She thanked me and promised to handle it from her end. I felt some satisfaction knowing he wouldn't get off scot-free. By afternoon, I'd packed Brianna's things and stacked them neatly in the living room. I didn't destroy anything, nor did I try to hide any of her belongings. I just wanted it all out of my house. Dave came by with lunch, and we laughed about the absurdity of it all, him filming Sean's hasty exit and me dismantling the bed. The absurdity masked the pain, a pain I knew would take time to fade. When Brianna arrived at 4, she glanced at the broken bed in the driveway before coming in. She had brought the company's van, clearly hoping to haul as much as she could. I offered her a seat, and she sat down, bursting into tears and begging for forgiveness. She promised that it was a mistake, that she still loved me and would do anything to make it right. She swore to quit her job at the print shop, cut ties with her mother, and even promised to have the second child I'd wanted. It's too late for promises, I said, shaking my head. 3 weeks ago, you could have saved our marriage by staying home. I gave you the choice, and you walked out. You made your bed with him. Now go lie in it. At that, she broke down, clutching her knees as if to contain herself. Please, Logan, she pleaded. It was just a mistake. I don't love him, not like I love you. It was just curiosity. I've never been with anyone else but you. I let her finish, then pushed a stack of papers across the table. Sign these divorce papers. Take what's yours and go. She stared at the papers in disbelief, realizing the reality of the situation. And if you try to fight this, remember that I have all the proof I need, I said, picking up the remote and pressing play. The screen filled with images of her and Sean, intimate and carefree. She let out a strangled cry, covering her face, unable to bear the sight of herself. Without another word, she signed the papers. I promised her she'd get visitation rights with our son and told her she was free to come see him so long as it wasn't at her mother's house. She nodded, too drained to argue. As she loaded the last of her belongings into the van, she looked at me one last time. I know I deserve this, she whispered, but I hope someday you'll understand. Maybe, I replied, but not today. Goodbye, Brianna. She drove away, leaving me with an empty house but a heart finally ready to move on. For the first time in years, I felt like my own man again, ready to start fresh, free of the lies and manipulation. After Brianna left, the divorce proceeded swiftly, thanks to the airtight prenuptial agreement her mother had insisted on. Ironically, that document, meant to protect the dragon's interests, now worked entirely in my favor, leaving Brianna with little claim to my assets. She didn't even try to contest it. Maybe the shock of seeing herself on video with Sean had stripped her of any will to fight. She just signed where I pointed, resigned to the life she'd chosen. With the divorce finalized, I was granted full custody of our son. Brianna could visit him often, but I set one condition. She couldn't take him to her mother's house or the summer house. She accepted without argument, possibly knowing that her mother's influence had played a role in tearing our family apart. Meanwhile, things began to fall apart for Brianna on multiple fronts. After I filed for divorce, she clashed with her mother more frequently, especially over money. The print shop was failing, and her mother had been refusing to pay her full salary for months. Frustrated and needing money to get a place of her own, Brianna finally sued her mother for back pay. The lawsuit drove a wedge between them, and when Brianna won, she collected her payout just 2 weeks before the print shop declared bankruptcy. Brett's legal advice had proven invaluable, ensuring she got her money before the bank seized the remaining assets. But for Brianna, there were other losses. She desperately tried to contact Sean, hoping he would be there for her now that her marriage was over. But Sean, after being exposed as a cheater, wanted nothing to do with her. His wife had received the video clips I'd sent, and upon returning from her UN assignment, she'd promptly divorced him. She even moved to Geneva with their kids, where she took a job with a new UN team and, as I heard later, began dating an Italian colleague. Sean had lost his marriage and turned to drinking to cope. Eventually, he took a leave of absence from his job, falling into a downward spiral that left him isolated. With her mother's business gone, no Sean, and no support system, Brianna's situation became bleak. Yet, she managed to find a modest apartment and got another job, though she had to start over at a lower wage. I heard through mutual friends that she rarely went out, spending most of her time with our son whenever she had visitation. She never mentioned the past or her regrets, though sometimes I'd see a shadow in her eyes that hinted at the cost of her choices. Through it all, I kept my distance. We cooperated over visitation for our son's sake, but there was no warmth left between us. I'd finally freed myself from her mother's manipulations, and I wasn't about to reopen that chapter. I was determined to protect my peace, and Brianna knew better than to ask me for anything more. One day, Brett came over to my place for a beer, and we laughed over how the dragon's carefully plotted prenuptial had backfired. "She tried to trap you," he said, clinking his bottle against mine, but it was her own daughter who walked into it. In the end, Brianna had nothing left but a paycheck and a small apartment. Her mother's print shop, once the pride of their family, was no more, and her relationship with her mother had shattered over money and betrayal. For all her manipulation, the dragon had only managed to ruin her daughter's happiness and her family's business. But that didn't bother me. I'd come out of the mess with my son, my business, and my freedom intact. The divorce was the last tie I needed to sever, and with that done, I was finally ready to close the book on my life with Brianna. For my own closure, I mailed a congratulations card to Brianna's parents. Dave had suggested it, and his mother even wrote it in her neat handwriting. "Dear friends, congratulations on your success. You managed to convince your daughter to leave a loving husband and father to become a fling for a married man. She must be grateful to you for the rest of her life. Yours truly." I'd heard through town gossip that the card had triggered a fight between Brianna's parents, with her father blaming himself for not standing up to his wife years ago. The card was a petty move, but after everything I felt it was a fitting end to their interference. In the months following the divorce, life moved forward in a way that felt calm and natural. I had left the chaos and resentment behind, and every day brought a fresh start. My son adjusted quickly to our new family life with Lauren, accepting her not as a replacement for his mother, but as someone who genuinely cared for him. Watching him settle into our new household brought me peace I hadn't felt in years. Lauren and I married in a small ceremony, with just a few close friends and family. After everything we'd both been through, neither of us wanted anything grand or elaborate. We found joy in simplicity, an honest, down-to-earth bond that didn't need dramatic declarations or extravagant gestures. We moved into a home we bought together, each of us letting go of our past lives, literally and emotionally. It was a fresh start, a chance to build something strong and lasting. With Lauren, every moment felt lighter. There were no hidden agendas, no distrust or suspicion, just two people choosing to be together every day. She was supportive of my work and didn't view my business success as a competition, something I'd never fully experienced with Brianna. Her easygoing nature and the warmth she brought into our home created an environment filled with laughter and genuine companionship. One evening, as we were putting away groceries, she placed her hand on her stomach, and I realized that our little family was about to grow. Lauren was pregnant, and we both couldn't be happier. The news filled me with a sense of hope and renewal. I felt ready to be a father again, this time with someone I knew would be by my side through everything. Our life together was falling into place in a way that felt both secure and joyful. Our Friday nights became cherished family traditions. Lauren, my son, and her daughter Chloe would gather around the table for board games or movie nights, laughter filling the room. It was during one of these nights that I truly understood what I had gained by leaving behind the toxic marriage with Brianna. I'd found a family that genuinely cared for each other, without the weight of manipulation and betrayal hanging over us. Brianna, meanwhile, seemed to be coping as best as she could. She still saw our son regularly, and we kept communication respectful for his sake. Her mother, who had once been so controlling, no longer had a place in either of our lives. I heard from mutual friends that Brianna rarely went out and seemed reserved. Her beauty was still striking, but the brightness in her eyes was often absent. Sometimes I felt a pang of pity for her, knowing that she'd been swept along by her mother's plans and lost more than she'd ever gained. Still, I had no regrets. My life with Lauren was what I'd longed for, an honest relationship built on mutual respect. Lauren and I didn't talk about the past much, but when we did, she would simply smile and say, "What matters is now. Let's make it a good life." Even Brett, who had seen me through every turbulent chapter, noticed the change. One afternoon over a beer, he remarked, "I don't think I've ever seen you this content, Logan." I nodded, realizing he was right. I wasn't just content, I was at peace. There was still a part of me that wished Brianna happiness, hoping she'd eventually find her own path. Our son would always connect us, and for his sake, I wanted her to rebuild her life. I felt no anger or bitterness anymore, only a distant memory of what once was. I'd made peace with the fact that our marriage had been a mistake, but also a lesson that led me to where I was now.